Hello again everyone from Tokyo, Japan, and welcome back to Japan Vintage Camera. Today's video is going to be about a really cool, interesting little 35mm scale focus camera, and this one is the Pigeon, or Pigeon 35, which was produced in Japan in the early 1950s. For those of you who are new to my channel, I sell vintage Japanese cameras at my online store, japanvintagecamera.com. I also have a Etsy store, and that is also called Japan Vintage Camera. If you'd like to buy this little Pigeon or another vintage Japanese camera, please visit one of my stores. I'll post links to my stores in the description below the video. So the Pigeon cameras were produced in Japan in the early 1950s, and they were designed mainly for the domestic Japanese market. Now, the economy in Japan in the early 1950s was not very strong. Japan was still recovering from the devastation of the war and still rebuilding its factories and infrastructure and all of that. And the economy was still growing. And at that time, growth wasn't really all that quick. So any product which was to be sold to the domestic economy had to offer a couple of things. First, it had to have at least a little amount of quality built into it, and the price had to be very reasonable. And the Pigeon 35mm camera is a very good example of this kind of effort to make something which was good quality for a reasonable price. The quality of the materials and workmanship on this camera is very high, but I guess the quality, or maybe not, I can't use the word quality, but just say that the level of sophistication is rather low. So the simplicity of its design and its components made it rather easier or less expensive to manufacture, and its simplicity was kind of offset by the higher quality of the materials which was used in its construction. Let's go ahead and take a look at the features, controls, and functions of the Pigeon 35. As you can tell you may or may not be able to tell, the Pigeon 35 is kind of modeled after the old Leica 1 camera, not a rangefinder camera, of course, a scale focus camera, and features a similar layout to the earlier Leica cameras. The first similarity you see is in the rewind knob and the film winding knobs, and also in the location of the finder here, and also the style of shutter release and the flash shoe. And though these are somewhat in slightly different locations than you find on the early Leica cameras, they are all basically the same thing and are all located somewhat similarly on the top of the camera. Leica was a legendary brand in Japan, and the Leica was one of the things which Japanese companies aspired to be able to produce in the pre-war era and then later on in the post-war era. And some people say that they succeeded in this pursuit of equaling or even beating Leica in the 1950s. But in the early 1950s, Japanese cameras were still not quite up to Leica standards. But on the other hand, they didn't really have to be all that high quality to do the job, which was required of them, from Japanese people during that time. The overall shape, it's a little bit smaller than the Leica. Leica's a little bit wider, and the Leica has rounded edges rather than the angular edges which you find on this one. And the front of the lens looks a little bit similar, but then after that, pretty much everything is different. The Leica is a focal plane shutter camera with shutter curtains which work on the inside back of the camera just in front of the film, whereas the Pigeon is a camera which has a what we call a leaf shutter, which is located just behind the lens. It's some distance between the lens and the film. But even so, there are a lot of virtues to the leaf shutter over the focal plane shutter. The first of which is that it vibrates much less and causes less motion in the camera. When you use a shutter plane or a focal plane shutter, the shutter curtains have to move. And they're not necessarily really large, but they do have some mass to them. And there are two rollers, which are usually made of metal, which take up the shutter curtains. And the inertia of these rollers, the momentum and the motion of the movement of the mass of the shutter curtains cause some vibration in the camera, which isn't present in leaf shutter cameras. So in certain situations, you will be able to take sharper photos with a camera like this than with a focal plane shutter camera. We'll go ahead and get started by looking at the features, controls, and functions. And here you have the film rewind knob with an arrow telling you which way to rewind the film. This knob is nice and tall, so it's quite easy to grasp if you have large fingers or are wearing gloves. Next to that, we have a socket for mounting a flash gun, or a shoe for mounting a flash gun. If you're going to use a flash on these cameras, be forewarned that it uses a Kodak style flash socket. So to use a more modern flash, you're going to need a PC adapter, which slides down and locks onto the Kodak flash socket. Next to that, you have a very small and tiny viewfinder. It doesn't have to be really large on one of these cameras because there is no split image to focus and there are no projected frame lines or anything like that. This is entirely adequate for one of these cameras. Next to that, you have the shutter release button with this kind of wide threaded thing which goes around it. If you remove this, then you can add an accessory cable release. This uses the same kind of cable release which you find on like the old twin lens reflex cameras. Behind it you find the release button, which you have to depress in order to rewind the film. And next to that you have the film winding knob with a counter which you kind of have to reset mechanically by turning it. On the back here we don't have anything, it's just very simple. On the bottom we have the latch for removing the film back. And like many old cameras, to load the film you have to remove the back completely from the camera. Loading the film in the camera is quite simple. You simply put your film cartridge right here. You stretch the film leader across the film chamber here and you feed it into the take-up spool. There's a spot right here and you simply keep winding it and operating the shutter until the film is pulled completely across and the holes on the top and the bottom of the film are engaged in the teeth here in the take-up spool. We have this little cool thing here that says Pigeon in the bottom. I've never noticed that before. But I really like this script. It's very modern, like something you would see nowadays and not something which was done back in the 1950s. Then you would put your film door back on and you would lock it in the correct position. And then you would, of course, wind the film a couple of times and fire the shutter. And then I would go ahead and set the counter to match the film that I have. So if I have, say, 36 exposures of film, I'll usually set this to around 37 or so, and then simply just start operating the camera. The main controls, being this is a leaf shutter camera, are located on the front here. This camera features a very simple system. On the back here we have the lever which charges the shutter. Over here on this side we have another lever, and this is what you use to select the aperture, and there's an aperture scale located here. And in between these two we have the dial which you use to set the shutter speed. And we go ahead and wind this up here. It's kind of difficult. I'm not used to the operation of this camera, but to operate this camera you wind the film to the next exposure and then cock the shutter, and then the camera is ready to use. You will not be able to wind the film before you charge the shutter, so keep that in mind. So say you try to operate it, or you try to push the shutter button a second time. It will not work until you wind the film onto the next exposure. On the top here we have a socket for attaching a standard cable release, so it's kind of interesting to have the two different systems here. And then on the very front, to focus the camera, you simply turn this dial. And this is of course arranged in feet, as this is an early 50s Japanese camera. And we have a focusing range of what it says here, about 3.5 feet all the way to infinity. And looking at this camera, I don't see, wait a second, yeah I do, there's a depth of field scale located right here on the front. So if you set your aperture, say, to f8, which is where I like to use it, and if I set my infinity mark at f8, that should mean pretty much everything between, looks like 2 meters and infinity should be at focus at f8. So a very good something for shooting street photography or whatever. Last thing to notice is this camera features not one but 2 tripod sockets located on the bottom. Another good reason why this flash shoe is located in the center here, besides being able to use an accessory finder, is that you couldn't use an accessory range finder. And the accessory range finder, these were made by all kinds of different people in different designs. Most of them were horizontal, some of them were vertical. You slide them in here and then you look through the split image or viewfinder on this range finder and you adjust it until you get the reading, and then you can take a look at the reading and then use the same reading on your lens. Anyway, that's it for my video about the Pigeon 35mm camera from about 1953 or so, I think this one is from. As I said, I'll be posting this camera for sale, hopefully tomorrow night, possibly the next night in my online store. So if you're interested in buying it, please check back. I have the original case for this camera, though unfortunately I don't have the original lens cap. Everything on this camera seems to work quite well, and it's an overall in really good condition for a vintage Pigeon. Anyway, if you like the video, please hit the like button. If you want to see more videos, please subscribe. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you tune in again soon.